1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. And the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, the length thereof was 60 cubits, and the breadth 20, and the height thereof 30 cubits. And the porch before the temple of the house, 20 cubits was the length, and according to the breadth of the house, and 10 cubits was the breadth thereof before the house. And the house he made of windows of narrow light, and against the wall of the house he built chambers round about, against the walls of the house round about, both of the temple and of the oracle, and he made chambers round about. The nethermost chamber was 5 cubits broad, and the middle was 6 cubits broad, the third was 7 cubits broad. For without the wall of the house he made narrowed rests round about, that the beams should not be fastened to the walls of the house. And the house, when it was in the building, was built of stone, made ready before it was brought thither, so that there was neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was in building. The door for the middle of the chamber was on the right side of the house, and they went up with winding stairs into the middle chamber, and out of the middle into the third. And so he built the house and finished it, and covered it with the house with beams and boards of cedar. And then he built chambers against all the house, 5 cubits high, and they rested on the house with timber of cedar. And the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, Concerning this house which thou art in building, if thou wilt walk in my statutes, and execute my judgments, and keep all my commandments to walk in them, then will I perform my word with thee, which I spake unto David my father, and I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. So Solomon built the house and finished it. Let's jump down to verse number 20. And the oracle in the foremost part was 20 cubits in length, and 20 cubits in breadth, and 20 cubits in the height thereof. And he overlaid it with pure gold. And so he covered the altar, which was of cedar. And so Solomon overlaid the house within with pure gold. And he made a partition by the chains of gold before the oracle, and he overlaid it with gold. And the whole house he overlaid with gold, until he had finished all the house. Also the whole altar that was by the oracle he laid with gold. And within the oracle he made 2 cherubims of olive tree, each 10 cubits high. And 5 cubits was the length, 5 cubits was one wing of the cherub, and the 5 cubits the other wing of the cherub. From the uttermost part of the one wing to the uttermost part of the other wing were 10 cubits, and the other cherub was 10 cubits. Both the cherubims were of one measure and one size, and the height of one cherubim was 10 cubits, and so it was of the other cherub. And he set the cherubims within the inner house, and they stretched forth the wings of the cherubim, so that the wing of the one touched the one wall, and the wing of the other cherub touched the other wall, and their wings touched one another in the midst of the house. And he overlaid the cherubims with gold, and he carved all the walls of the house round about with carved figures of cherubims and palm trees and open flowers within and without. And the floor of the house he overlaid with gold within and without. And then jump down to verse 37. In the 4th year of the foundation of the house of the Lord laid in the month Ziph, and in the 11th year in the month Bul, which was the 8th month, was the house finished throughout all the parts thereof, and according to all the fashion of it. And so was he 7 years in building it. So as I mentioned last week, chapters 5 through 9 of 1 Kings are wholly dedicated to the construction and dedication of the temple. And I just wanted to make mention of this. When we went through the book of Exodus, and I know that was several years ago, but when we went through the book of Exodus, I did a kind of a more lengthy study on the tabernacle, and we went into great detail, and we talked about all the various pieces of furniture and the construction of it, and kind of see or looked at some of the symbology of those pieces and that kind of thing. If that's something you want, you can just let me know. I will gladly let you have those lessons. First Kings doesn't go into the detail that Exodus did, but if that's something you're interested, I do have that, and I can give that to you. But here, First Kings is just more interested in giving us just the kind of, not the bare minimum, but just kind of some bare details, getting us to the completion of the project. And I think for a few reasons, which we'll see over the next couple of chapters. And so here in verse number 1, remember chapter 5, they were gathering the materials. And so chapter 5 was concerned with getting things prepared for the construction. And then obviously here in chapter 6, we see the construction taking place. But with those materials now prepared, the time for building had come. But before we get to construction, we first see some chronology, which I find interesting, that both the chapter ends and begins with a chronological look as to the date of the construction of the temple. And so it says in verse 1, it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that they began the house of the Lord. And so this date does a couple of things. Number one, it helps us date the Exodus. Solomon's reign is pretty much generally agreed, almost universally so. There's very little dissension in this, that Solomon's reign began in the year 70-71, and in 970-71 A.D. And so that puts the Exodus, if we're in the 4th year of Solomon's reign and you add 480 years to that, that puts the Exodus in 1145-46 A.D. And that is the conservative date. And what I mean by that is conservative scholars hold to that 1145 date. Liberal scholars do not. Liberal scholars push that date about 200 to 300 years in the future, and they do that for various historical reasons. And what they do here is they say, well, 480 is not literal, 480 is symbolic, 480 represents 12 generations. And so it doesn't literally mean 480 years, blah, 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 blah. They go on, they give all these reasons. But there's no reason for us to just simply say 480 doesn't mean 480. It means 480. And beyond that, it doesn't just give us 480. It specifically says in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, in the 4th month. It's giving us very specific detail, which would be odd if he's being symbolic and not literal. And so it does that. It helps us date the Exodus. But more importantly so, it shows us, the way that I want to phrase this, the spiritual completion of the Exodus. The spiritual completion of the Exodus. And so the Exodus obviously had a physical function, which was to bring God's people out of Israel and put them in the land that he promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all these. And so they had the physical function of being the means to fulfill that particular promise. But there's also a spiritual side of this. And there's a couple of different texts we could have given to this, but I think this one is the most clear. And so in Exodus chapter 15, this is directly following God leading the Israelites through the Red Sea. And of course, we understand the Red Sea closes down upon Pharaoh's men, and there's, at this particular point, safety for the Israelites. Of course, they still have the wilderness, but that's due to their own fault. We understand all that. But after God leads them through the Red Sea, the following chapter, there's a song of praise. And in chapter 15 of Exodus, this is the song of praise. And one of the verses, verse 17, it says this: "Thou shalt bring them in, and plant them in the mountain of thine inheritance, in the place, O Lord, which thou hast made for thee to dwell in the sanctuary, O Lord, which thy hands have established." And so one of the things that the Israelites understood, even at this particular point, that God was bringing the Israelites out of Egypt into the promised land, not just so that they would have their own land, but so that God's name would have a place, and in this particular point, they would say sanctuary, that God's name would have a place. And it wouldn't just be, he's the God of Israel. No, he's the God of Israel who dwells in the temple, in Jerusalem. This is where you come if you want to meet with God. You go to this particular place. And so this was something that the Israelites had kind of understood would eventually take place. And why that's important is because God, and we'll talk, I don't want to get ahead of myself too much. We'll see this here in just a little bit. But God led Israel, sovereignly so, to the position where they were ready as a nation to make this take place. Okay, I won't say any more about that right now because we'll get into that more in just a moment. But so the building, the construction of the temple then, yes, it gives us some historical date markers, but much more importantly so, it is the spiritual completion of the Exodus. The reason why God had brought them out, one of those reasons is now fulfilled with the building of the temple. And so as far as the kind of details of the temple, I'm not going to bog you down with this. I'm just trying to condense this all down for you. I did try to find, I was going to try and print off a picture. There's a lot of depictions and artist renderings and things like that of the temple, and I didn't find one that I thought would print off very clear. And I was going to hand that out, but you can go online. There's all kinds of renderings of this. You do not have to be careful though, because sometimes a lot of people confuse this with the second temple. This is not the temple that existed at the time of Christ. This is Solomon's temple. It's a different temple. The one that existed at the time of Christ, a lot of times it's referred to as Zerubbabel's, or sometimes referred to as Herod's. King Herod built onto it greatly, and it was significantly larger than this one. But this one is in its own right impressive, as we'll see here in a moment. But you can go online and see some, I think, some pretty fascinating renderings of it. But the exterior of the temple, and this is just the building itself, I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second, was 60 cubits in length, which is about 90 feet. Now, a cubit, if you don't know, a cubit is on average, about 18 inches. Typically, the way they measured this, and it was probably based on the foreman of the project, but typically they measured this as it would be from the elbow to the middle finger, the length of your forearm, essentially. And on average, that was about 18 inches. And so it was 60 cubits in length, 90 feet, 20 cubits in width, 30 feet, 30 cubits high, 45 feet. That's an impressive building, especially when you consider the manner in which it was built, with these hewn stones covered in cedar, as we'll see in a minute, overlaid entirely with gold. Right? I mean, this is a very impressive building. And like I said, that is just the building. That does not include the porch on the front, nor does it include the various chambers on the sides. And so there was kind of a three-tiered chamber system that surrounded the building, and they probably used that for storage and a litany of other things. But this is just the temple proper. And so 90 feet by 30 feet by 45 feet. It's a large building. And so the building was impressive, not only in its size, which, obviously that would have stood out, but once you got close and you begin to see the detail that went into the building itself, it would have brought anybody to understand how impressive of a undertaking this was. And so there was a grand beauty, but also the care in which it was built. We read there just a little bit ago, we saw in chapter 5 that they were preparing the stones, and they squared the stones, and they got the stones ready. Well, here in chapter 6, we see that they got the stones so precise before they started the construction that it says there that in verse 7 it says that and the house when it was in building was built of stone made ready before it was brought thither, so that there was neither a hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was in building. And so it seems as though, obviously there was no command by God for this. God never sat down and said, by the way, when you're building the temple, do not dare use a hammer while you're putting it together. He didn't say that. And so what seems to be the most likely is that probably Solomon commanded this as a way to give reverence to God while they were in the process of building God's house. And so, but what it also shows us is the precise nature of the engineering of the building, that they were able to get the stones prepared so precisely beforehand. All they had to do was set them in place. No hammering, no chiseling, nothing, none of that sort was necessary. Everything was ready to go. And so they put the stones together, and then the stones, once they were together, they were covered inside and out with cedar, the cedar that they had received from Lebanon that we saw in chapter 5. And then those cedars were carved with various images of cherubim, palm trees, and flowers. The degree to which they were carved, we don't know. I don't know if it was every single piece of cedar was covered in these carvings, or if they were kind of sporadically placed throughout, but variously so. There are these carvings of the cherubim, the palm trees, the flowers, and then the building, the floors, and the doors, all overlaid with gold. And so again, you can just kind of get this image in your mind of this rather large building, not the biggest thing that was ever built in antiquity, but a large building, and then covered in cedar, which we understand. Cedar, I mean, people still use cedar all the time for its beauty and for its lasting quality, and so covered in cedar, and then that cedar covered in gold. And so you can understand how impressive this was. And then you get to the oracle, and it uses the term oracle. That's referencing the Holy of Holies. That's what that is talking about. And even more so, we see more things that kind of impress. And so they had the Holy of Holies, and then for the Holy of Holies, they had fashioned out of olive trees 2 cherubim. And each of these cherubim were 10 cubits high. Each of the cherubim had outstretched wings, and also covered in gold. And so as soon as the high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies, he would be met not only with the ark, and the ark itself had cherubims over the ark, over the mercy seat, and then there's large 15-foot tall cherubim with 10-foot wings, with wings outstretched so that the tip of one wing of the one cherubim reaching to the tip of the wing of the other cherubim stretched the entire span of the Holy of Holies. Again, it's so impressive to me that this was done, considering the high priest was the only man who was ever going to see this. And yet, it was done. It was done why? It was done for the purposes of worship. Again, I'll get into that more so in just a moment. But again, all of this being done overlaid with gold, all of this being, every piece is put in place exactly as it's supposed to be. And then as we saw at the end of the chapter, all in all, the building took 7 years to complete. And it's really no wonder why when we consider its size, when we consider its intricacy, when we consider its brilliance, all of these things. And then not to mention, they're not only are they limiting themselves with the tools that they had at the time, but the tools that they had at the time are obviously nothing compared to the tools we have today. And so obviously 7 years, it's understandable why, I mean, with all the city regulation, it probably takes 7 years to build this today. But nevertheless, it took a long time for them to do this because of the care and everything, the planning, everything that went into this. Now, it is this exact fact that it was so intricate. It was so beautiful. It had all this gold, all of this. It was so extravagant. It leads some people to say, well, this was wasteful. There are complaints against this. This is wasteful. It shouldn't have been done this way. There's other better things Solomon could have done with the money raised for the temple, other better things he could have done with all the gold that was used to go into the temple. It's the same exact kind of argument, and I thought about putting this reference in here. I ended up not doing it. But in the Gospels, if you remember Jesus, it's very close to the time when Jesus was about to go to the cross. And the woman pours the perfume on Jesus' feet, right? And she starts to use her hair to kind of wash Jesus' feet. And his disciples, namely Judas, but his disciples throw a fit about this. That's wasted, right? She could have sold that money. She could have given it to the poor. Now, what he really wanted was to pocket that money himself. But, they make a fit. They throw an argument. Why would she do this? Such a waste. And Jesus said, it's not wasted if it was used on me. Right? Y'all don't have me here forever. I'm here for a limited time. And she's pouring out an offering upon me. And so the same kind of concept applies. Is it possible to waste? Yeah, absolutely. Is it possible to throw money and utilities, resources, and things at projects that ultimately are wasteful? Absolutely, that's possible. But it depends on what it's being used for and the utility of what it's being used for. And so Solomon was simply continuing in the footsteps of his father. When David bought the very land that this temple is being built upon, if you remember the threshing floor of Onan, and Onan comes to David and he just wants to give it to him. Right? He says, well, just take it. And David responds, he says, I will surely buy it of thee of a price, neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God of that which does cost me nothing. David said, no, I will not offer God the bare minimum. I won't do it. I will give him the best, and I will give him all that I can give. That's exactly what Solomon does. And so it was a building meant to represent the very presence of God. Right? Now again, don't confuse this. This is not to say that God only presided in the temple. That's not what I mean by that. God is omnipresent. He wasn't ever in the temple and not everywhere else. Right? No, it was a representation of his presence. He was there, but he's also everywhere, right? And so the temple was the physical representation of God's manifest presence on earth. And because that's the case, it couldn't be anything but magnificent. It's holding the creator of our universe. And this is where you go to meet with him. And therefore, they wanted it to be as grand as possible. Now, furthermore, and this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, the temple was built in a time of peace and prosperity. We have seen this a couple of times now in 1 Kings already, where it talks about the peace that Solomon was basically handed, right? I mean, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. David couldn't build the temple because of all the bloodshed, because of all the wars that David was involved with. But what that bloodshed and what those wars accomplished was to hand to his son a time of peace wherein Solomon didn't have to get involved in all those wars, and he could be focused on what? Building the temple. He could be focused on making this particular place for God. And so Israel is at this point at a time of prosperity. We've seen some of the deals that Solomon has been making, and all these kings are coming because they're impressed with Solomon's wisdom. And Israel was at this time, as far as just prosperity is concerned, probably maybe even better than under David. I've talked about Israel was its greatest under David. But under Solomon, they may have been more prosperous. That doesn't necessarily, that's not the end all, we understand. But they may have been more prosperous under Solomon. And so they have peace, they have the prosperity necessary. So they were not robbing the poor to build the temple. That's not what they were doing. They were giving of their excess, and I will say this, excess graciously given to them by God during a time of peace given to them by God. Right? And so everything that's being done for the purposes of building the temple was a blessing, was a gift to them by God. And so they used that gift to then turn around and give it right back. They used that gift to turn around and bless God, to worship God. And it's the same thing that should exist today. God blesses us in certain ways, certain talents, some gifts and things that he gives, spiritual and physical. And we should, in turn, use those gifts and give them right back to God. And I'm not just talking about, giving money. That's not what I'm just talking about. That could apply, but more so our spiritual gifts. He gives us things for the intended purpose of using them for his glory. And so this is exactly what I believe Israel was doing with the building of the temple. They were using the gifts that God gave them for the intended purpose of giving back and worshiping and glorifying their God. And I have no complaints. I'm not under a single complaint to give. I think they did everything that they should have done. Now, what I want to do is I want to come back to verse 11. And so this is a very fascinating thing. So if you're reading through chapter 6, you get the little chronological note in verse 1, and then verses 2 through 10 deal with the exterior dimensions and the outside of the temple, and then you have verses 11, 12, and 13, and then from verse 14 on, it deals with the interior of the temple, and then again another chronological note at the end. And then you have verses 11, 12, and 13 right here kind of in the middle of the chapter that are seemingly so out of place. So out of place that if you just read from verse 10 to verse 14, you wouldn't even notice anything had been missing. But verses 11, 12, and 13, I think, serve a tremendous purpose in this chapter. And so tucked away right here in the middle, God speaks to Solomon, and he says, concerning this house which thou art in building, if thou wilt walk in my statutes and execute my judgments and keep all my commandments to walk in them, he says, then will I perform my word with thee, which I spake on the day with thy father, and I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. And so right in the middle of the building and the project and everything's going on, God sends a message to Solomon. So this message from God takes place right after the description of the exterior of the building, right before the description of the interior of the building. And again, I think that was purposeful. Thus, right before we get to the literal heart of Israel's worship, God reminds Solomon of his command for obedience. Right? And so we have the exterior of the building, and then right after this we start talking about the Holy of Holies and all of the things that took place on the inside, which was the heart of Israel's worship. And so right before doing that, God sends Solomon a message. Hey, don't forget the obedience that is required for Israel. And why does this matter? Because as you get later on in Israel's history, you come to find that by and large, they did most of the things, not all, but they did most of the things that God told them to do. They were still doing the sacrifices. They were still keeping the feasts. But the problem was they either weren't doing them as they totally were supposed to do them, or, more importantly, they did them with no heart of actual worship. And so what God was reminding Solomon here is not just every year the high priest needs to come in and make a sacrifice for the Day of Atonement. He's supposed to do that, but you're supposed to know why. And you're supposed to understand the purpose and the meaning behind it all. It wasn't just, if we do X, Y, and Z, God will be happy. No, it's if we follow in the obedience of the command that we have been given with a heart of worship, then we will satisfy God. Because God will tell them later on in the minor prophets, I hate your sacrifices. He will say it. I hate it. I don't want it anymore. Why? Because you were doing X, Y, and Z, but you had no heart for it. And then you get to the New Testament, you have the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus constantly bringing them back to, you've gotten away from the heart of the law. You might be doing some of the things that the law tells you to do, but you have no reason to do them. You don't even know why you're doing them anymore. And so it was all supposed to be for worship. And so God, again, right before getting into the interior of the building, God comes to Solomon and says, hey, don't forget my commandments. Don't forget them. Don't just do them, but do them in the right way. Do them with the right heart. And if you do that, right, then I will dwell among the children of Israel. Then I will not forsake my people Israel. And we know, like I said, we know that they didn't do this. And what happened? God forsook his people Israel. God led them into condemnation and into judgment, both Israel and Judah. We'll see all that as we go on. And so here was a very important reminder for Solomon, and by means of Solomon for Israel, of what that building was for. And so this building, the temple, was never intended to be just a beautiful edifice. It was intended to be a constant reminder of the splendor of Israel's God, that God who deserves their worship. One thing, so after this temple is destroyed, and the nation of Judah goes to Babylonian captivity for 70 years, they finally get the ability to return, and they come back into the land, and they start on the temple. They want to rebuild, and they start on it, but then very quickly, what do they say? They say, oh, hold on, we don't have homes, so we're gonna pause on the temple, and we're going to go focus on our homes. Well, they do that, and then instead of immediately returning, they say, well, you know what? We want better homes, and so we're going to make our homes a little bit nicer. And then they neglect the temple, but we're still not done. We want our homes to be even nicer, and so they keep focusing on themselves, and the temple, which they had started, had just kind of gone to waste at this point. And eventually, God raises up some men and stirs their heart, and they finish the temple. And what happens is, after the rebuilding of the temple, there were a few, probably not many, but there were a few men who were alive, old enough to be alive to have seen the previous temple, are now looking at this one, and they begin to weep. They begin to weep because they say, it's nothing like the old one. What is this? It's nothing like the old one. But they'd missed the point. It doesn't matter what that building is. It doesn't matter what the building looks like. It mattered what the purpose of the building was. Again, the purpose was to remind Israel of their God, a God who deserves their worship. It didn't matter if it was just a mud brick house. Now, like I said, I think it was proper that they decorated the way that they did. But that was never what it had to be. And so what Israel had to remember was the purpose of the building. Because eventually what happened is the temple itself became an idol. The temple itself became the means of their worship, the means of their devotion, instead of it became the object of the worship instead of the means to worship what it was originally given for. Instead of coming to the temple to worship God, they came to the temple because, oh man, look at the temple. Look at the wonder of the temple. Even in the New Testament, they come to Jesus, and Jesus says, hey, this building's not going to last. It's going to be torn down. And they wanted to kill him for that, right? And so we can see what the temple eventually became. It became a source of national pride instead of a place of worship. And that became a problem. Now, if they didn't do that, if they remembered what this was all about, God would dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. But I do want to notice, and we'll close looking at this, this condition was given to Solomon personally. Look at the personal pronouns here. As God is speaking, he says, if thou will walk in my statutes and execute my judgment and keep all my commandments, then I will perform my word with thee, which I spake unto David, thy father. And so you, Solomon, if you do this, I will bless Israel. So again, we could say, well, God's being unfair here, laying all of the weight of Israel upon the shoulders of this one man. But we've talked about this several times already. God's blessing was predicated on Israel's obedience as a whole. But as we've seen, as the king, so goes the nation. Right? I mean, we've said that several times already. If Solomon remained faithful, you know what the people do? They would remain faithful because they're following the example of their king. David remained faithful, and by and large, Solomon inherited a faithful nation. Well, guess what happens with Solomon? Solomon doesn't remain faithful. And guess what happens after Solomon? The nation splits because they're no longer unified. And so we see that God knew exactly what he was doing. The commandment was appropriate because God knows the influence of the man that he had put in charge. And so this was a reminder to the man of God of his place as the representative of God. And yes, the king of Israel was a political king. We understand that. But he was also God's representative in that particular position. And so it was a unique role at this particular time. And so as the king goes, so goes the nation. And that remained true for Israel's entire history. And by that I mean both Israel and Judah. As for Israel's sake, for the northern kingdom, after Solomon, they never had a good king again. They always had ungodly kings. And as they got ungodly